One question, one story, one continent. This is your podcast, Africa Daily, with me, Alan Kasuja. Podcasts from the BBC World Service are supported by advertising.
Hello, this is Hannah from Red Handed. Would you like to watch something scary? Like really scary? So scary you'll hide behind the sofa? Then you need Shudder. Shudder offers everything from the latest releases like The Boy Behind the Door and Psycho Gorman to untouchable favourites like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween. Polygon describes Shudder as a horror movie paradise. And they aren't wrong. Shudder is the ultimate collection of classic and original horror which pushes boundaries and showcases original storytelling with something new to watch every week. It's available right now, ad-free and on demand through all of the platforms you already use. Sign up now at shudder.com. That's shudder.com. Shudder. So good, it's scary.
For many countries, discovering oil within their borders means, well, money. Ka-ching! Lots of it. Money that, if used well, can make a huge difference in people's lives. Just think of all the things governments can build with a bit of extra cash. Roads, schools, houses. But here's the problem. Sometimes, if that wealth isn't properly managed, people might end up feeling left out. Just look at the southeast of Nigeria. The region is super rich in oil. And still, many people there feel they are yet to benefit from the huge sums of money being made off the back of oil production. And believe me, this has been a political football for many years. But if you've been keeping an eye on the news, you'll know that something's happening that might, just might, make the future a bit different. A law, the Petroleum Industry Bill, or PIB. It's meant to reform the oil and gas sector in Nigeria and fix many of the problems that have plagued it for years. But what does it actually do, and will it make a difference? I'm Alan Kasuja, and this is Africa Daily. The Petroleum Industry Bill has been nearly 20 years in the making. 20 years! When politicians started thinking about it, this was a hit on the radio.
She saw the marks on my shoulder. Wasn't me. Heard the words that I told her.
I bet that made you feel old, huh? But anyway, after such a long process, no wonder President Muhammadu Buhari sounded so pleased when he finally signed the bill into law.
I am delighted to address Nigerians on the ascent of the Petroleum Industry Bill. As a nation that depends on oil resources for the development of other sectors, Nigeria runs a petroleum industry that is governed largely by laws enacted over 50 years ago. This lack of progress has stagnated the growth of the industry and the prosperity of our economy.
Without this law, he said, Nigeria missed out on billions of dollars worth of investments, all because the laws of the oil sector were, well, out of date. But of course, that's not the only problem that's been plaguing the industry. Just ask around, especially in oil-rich areas, and you'll see. For many communities, oil production has come at a cost. Just have a listen to Dr. Isaac Oswoka. He's a community activist from Port Harcourt, Nigeria's oil capital.
The Nigerian oil industry has been immensely profitable for the transnational corporations that have controlled production for over 5 decades. For the people of the communities of the Niger Delta, however, oil has been a disaster. The oil industry in Nigeria is one of the most environmentally destructive in the world. And widespread environmental devastation has resulted in the loss of fishing and farming livelihoods. And with it comes massive impoverishment of communities that mostly do not have access to the most basic social amenities. Beyond the Niger Delta, oil has also had massive negative impacts for the Nigerian society and economy. The Nigerian government relied on easy money really from petroleum export and allowed other sectors to decay.
No surprise then, with so many issues to tackle, that the law to reform the oil industry has taken so long to come through. Now, new laws don't usually set anyone's heart racing, but those in the know believe this one could have a massive impact.
I think it's a pretty big deal.
That's Rolake Akinkube Filani. She's an advisory board member at the African Energy Chamber. She's been watching the industry for decades.
I mean, the first signs of anything resembling this happened in the early 2000s, when I was still an undergraduate in university. So that gives you an idea just how far we've come. But it's such a high stakes bill because it essentially seeks to rewrite the entire trajectory of Nigeria's oil and gas sector, which has been the subject of much contention for decades, primarily because there's a perception that the oil industry is this enclave industry that doesn't benefit the wider economy from a developmental perspective. So the fact that the parochial interest, the variety of views, the discontent over this has finally resulted in a bill passed by both houses that assented to by the president is a pretty big deal in Nigeria today.
Androlake says it's been difficult to reform the industry, partly because of its size, partly because of its importance to the Nigerian economy.
If we look at the economic contribution of the oil and gas sector to Nigeria today, it accounts for roughly about 80% of foreign exchange receipts for the country. There is such a huge demand on the usage of proceeds, whether that's in terms of investment in the wider economy, allocation of the proceeds of oil amongst the various states. And then if you take into account the fact that many of the legislators were under a huge amount of pressure from various factions and interest groups wanting to lay claim to how the allocation of those receipts should happen, then you kind of understand why this is taking so long. Having said that, there are many positives to having had this bill now become law, such as the fact that there'll be clarity around the development of gas infrastructure and the fiscal regime for gas. The 3% operating expenditures that will be given by oil companies to host communities is a positive, not as high as most of the Niger Delta communities would have wanted. But I think all of that coming together are some of the positives out of this, as well as the restructuring of some key state agencies in the oil and gas industry.
It's really interesting that you raised the 3% allocation to the host communities, because that has been an issue for a while, has it not, especially in the Delta region. For a lot of our listeners who might not be familiar with the background to that and why that development is important, could you just put it into context for us?
In the last 2 decades, we've had a variety of militant groups emerge in the Niger Delta. They've all primarily emerged out of the socio-economic grievances that communities, which they claim to represent, have had with regards to the government and with regards to oil and gas operators. And they have been saying for a long time is, give us what is rightfully ours. That's the clamor they've had. And so part of it, the introduction of this host communities development fund was meant to try and appease some of those socioeconomic grievances. But the feeling and feedback is that it doesn't go far enough. So the feeling of stakeholders and policy was that, half a loaf of bread is better than nothing at all.
And yet, President Buhari does believe the bill offers a good deal for local people.
The Act provides for a direct benefit framework that will enable sustainable development of host communities. I appeal to the host communities to look carefully at the contents of the bill, which in the implementation will bring real and lasting benefits to them.
And of course, by benefits, he means in part the 3% Rolake was talking about, the Host Communities Development Fund. The question is it enough to satisfy all those people who for so many years have felt left out of the party? Have a listen to Dr. Isaac Oswoka again. He campaigns for some of the communities that are meant to benefit from the fund, but he's skeptical.
This is an opportunity lost. It is more of the same, really. The emphasis of the new law is the commercialization and profitability of the oil industry. We are going to have, with the new law, maybe better possibilities for using gas for energy generation, with the possibility of third-party local energy investors having access to gas. So these are potentially promising aspects of the new law. However, when it comes to environmental protection, there is nothing new. In fact, the Petroleum Industry Act further weakens what was already a poor environmental protection regime. What the Act provides for is the requirement for companies to produce an environmental management plan. That is all, a plan, an intention, so to speak, to do good. And then we have the commission, which has the main mandate to promote profitability of the oil business. This is the commission that is granting license to operators. This is a classic case of conflict of interest. What we need is a strong, independent institution to enforce environmental regulation. But we didn't get anything of the sort with the new law.
Host communities are going to be entitled to some money, 3%. We've heard of operational costs. Surely that is a sign of progress. That is development, is it not?
If you compare the 3% of companies' budgets with what was originally proposed in the original bill in 2008, what was proposed by the government at that time was 10% of equity in all petroleum investments to be granted to the host communities. No, what we now have is 10% of budget. It's a far cry from what was originally proposed. So this is grossly inadequate, considering the enormous losses that these communities have had to endure over the past years.
So those communities may not be fully convinced by this bill, but what about the companies themselves? What do they make of the changes the law is introducing? Here's Rolake, the energy analyst again.
It's welcome news. It gives them more certainty as on the path to expect in terms of taxes and royalties and things for the next few years. It puts some clarity around their ability to plan and budget. At least now they know that 3% of their operating expenditures will have to go into this host communities development trusts. But it also gives them a legal and a governance structure for how that will operate. So concerns around transparency and corruption and diversion of funds are somewhat tamed. I think we're going to see more definitive moves to introduce social programs in health, in education, in housing. There is really now a greater alignment of interests. Call it enlightened self-interest, which I hope will kick in as a result of this legislation being passed.
So where do you see the industry in the next 5 or 10 years?
I see an industry that will have to grapple with the realities of the shifting global energy landscape. The very glaring omission in this piece of legislation is the near silence there is on the energy transition and the realities of now trying to commandeer an industry where investors are increasingly reluctant to finance because of pressures around climate change and carbon emissions. And that will be key, how Nigeria grapples with that. So I think the industry will still be here in the next 10, 20 years because oil is still central to most African economies. But I do think that much of that industry will now need to be domesticated because it's going to be that much harder to attract foreign capital to develop this industry.
Africa Daily is a BBC World Service production. Neil Gallagher and Marco Silva produced this episode. Kevin Silverton is our editor. If you're a fan of the podcast, I've got a small favor to ask you. The show's just about to reach its first 1 million downloads, and I can't wait to hit the milestone. So if you can, please tell your friends about the show. Get them to listen in, to download it, and if they can, to subscribe to it. Together, we'll hit that 1 million mark. I'm Alan Kasuja with 2 J's. Thanks for listening.
Now to a shocking corruption scandal in Baltimore.
Their oath is to protect and serve.
He pulled me over with some dumb excuse, handcuffed me, searched the car. I was robbed by Baltimore City police, armed robbery.
But what happens when cops don't protect your home, but invade it?
I heard my daughter screaming. I jumped out of my bed. I took maybe 1 to 2 steps. Cop had a gun pointed in my face.
And the only thing they serve is their own self-interest.
It was just an abundance of narcotics, things that weren't making it to the evidence room.
When drug dealers collude with law enforcement. Bad Cops from the BBC World Service.
Altogether, it's around $1.75 million in drugs and cash.
Search for Bad Cops wherever you get your podcasts.